Welcome everyone
tile.
for our second presentation this afternoon. We have Eileen Nowikowski, who is a docent at the Detroit Institute of Arts. She's also a local resident here in Huntington Woods. She's going to do a presentation on In the Garden. So, thank you.
Okay, so welcome. The DIA has this program called Behind the Scenes, and we have over 20 different programs. This is one of them, and it contains artwork from the museum. So everything that you will see here is actually in the museum's collection. Not everything is on view. So we have 60,000 works, more or less, in the museum. 6,000 are on view at any one time. Particularly photography, those items are very fragile and those don't go on view a lot. So some of the photographs you'll see in here rarely go on view, but they do. So this is a show called In the Garden, and the idea behind this really was to look at why people like gardens and what do we find in gardens and how are gardens treated in the world of fine art. You know, and you'll also see that there'll be animals in this one. So this is gardens and animals as well. And the big idea is that people have loved to look at gardens and animals for as long as artists have created them. And we'll learn a little bit about some of the hidden symbolism in the artwork. And we'll build an appreciation for the objects and meaning. And hopefully have you all come down to the museum and see some of the works. Okay, and some things are more complicated than you would originally see. So let's go down, we'll advance the slides, and we'll start with this one. Okay, Rachel Rijks, a Dutch painter, and she's quite fascinating. This was done in 1704, part of what was called the kind of the Great Dutch, what do they call it? Dutch Golden Age, and that name has changed for a variety of reasons, but I think we still use it in our galleries. Very rare to have a woman artist, and she was the daughter of a botanist, and she learned to draw with her dad, who studied botany, and she learned to do all the detailed drawings with him and through him. But she was a master painter, and she ended up being a court painter. She was that much recognition for her work that she was elevated to the status of court painter. Now, if you look at this, and if I walked over there, it would be bad for the video, but if you look at it, some of the things that you'll notice on this is that you've got flowers of different seasons. Those of you that are gardeners might know that you might have orchids and various, I don't think you've got orchids in there, but you've got tulips blooming, you have that Asiatic lily, white one blooming at the same time. You have roses blooming. Well, that was the virtue of being an artist, is you could combine them, flowers that don't normally bloom at the same time, and put them together in one composition. The Dutch were known for their still lifes like this. They were known for their floral still lifes. In fact, one of the things they did was these still lifes were a representation or a symbol of sort of the span of life. It was called a veritas. Let's see if I can find the term. Yeah. Veritas is close enough. Vanitas. Memento mori. So it's an idea that life is a cycle. And, you know, the native people obviously knew that a lot. That we have birth and we have maturation and then we have death. And when they would see a painting like this, they would understand that that was one of the messages here. And so what you're seeing is you'll see some blooms that are just about to bloom. You'll see some flowers beginning, like the tulip in the middle, to blossom out. You'll see flowers in full bloom, and you'll see flowers and other objects that are decaying. You can see on the far right there's an apple, and it looks kind of like it's beginning to rot. So it says this is life, remember. You know, it's all a cycle. And then you see various insects, and you see one at the bottom here, and there are other insects throughout this. The insects preyed on some of the plants, as those of us that are gardeners know, and it was part of the cycle of life that you're going to have things like that. You're going to have insects, you're going to have things that attack life and that bring it to a close, but that's all part of the natural scheme of things. She was so proficient in her art that this looks like a photograph. It is amazing. It is on view in the Dutch galleries, so I really recommend that. One of the things that we point out in this is the tulip in the middle that looks variegated, you know, with a red and white. That's a result of a virus. And so it originally was not anything that they expected, but the population loved it, became very, very popular, and so they were bred with this virus to create that image of a tulip. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay. This is, oh good, this is a close-up of this one. And you can see the tulip beginning to unfurl there, and then what looks like a poppy on the side here in full bloom. I don't know if we can see any insects in this one. Maybe a little one at the bottom, I'm not sure, of the tulip. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, we've got more of this variegated tulip. Grand perfection and happy generation tulips. Okay, we'll move on to the next. We were speaking of Native Americans, and this is a shield, Cheyenne culture, Native American. And it was a shield that was used by a warrior to protect in battle. And it's made out of a buffalo hide, I believe. It may be covered with deer skin. And one would think that that might be good protection against an arrow, not so good protection against bullets. And that was a story for a lot of Native American peoples. The technology of the colonial powers overcame their limited technology. But we'll see on this on the shield so much symbolism here, and these were symbols that were to enhance him and protect him in battle. It was a battle of Washita, warrior shield. There was in the middle what looks to me like a big black image. It almost looks like a ghost thing. You see that big black circle? That's really a thunderbird. And a thunderbird was a mythical creature in many Native American cultures, and it offered protection. So it was a symbol of the upper world, which was the world of the spirits, and it offered protection to the warriors. And they claim here that a Cheyenne warrior named Little Rock saw the shield in a dream, and the thunderbirds offered him protection. So there are other symbols that are on here. Let's advance and see what you get in terms of some detail. On the left, that's a constellation of stars, Pleiades. And on the right, you can see more detail of the thunderbird itself. The image in kind of turquoise blue that you can see on the border is Mother Earth. That's an image of the earth. The eagle feathers were also a sign of protection, and only Native American people are allowed to possess eagle feathers. So this was a fascinating shield. We know that Little Rock, the owner of the shield, was killed by General Custer, his troops at the Battle of Washita in late 1868, and the shield, as well as the Cheyenne prisoners, were taken by the 7th Cavalry. So it has got a lot of history to it. Let's see. It says here, shield owners have a vision during a dream where the animal spirit appears, and we said the painted cover is buckskin, which covers the buffalo core. And you can see other birds here. In the spirit, I would say mythology, but spirit theology of Native people, birds are symbols of the spirit world, and then there are other symbols of earth, and then there's symbols of the underworld, the sea world, turtles and things like that. Okay, let's move to the next. That shield is on view in our Native American gallery. This is a really popular piece, Edwin Landseer, British. It's called Chevy, and when you look at that, you can see a number of things here. We love to use this one with children and ask them what they see and what's going on in this picture. And one thing we see for sure is this dog kind of curled up in front of this big stag that has been killed. We know that it's been killed. We see blood down by the antlers here. We also see a trail of blood on what would be the right-hand side, and some crows following the trail of blood. And the idea behind the picture was that when the hunting occurred, and the deer was felled by a hunter, usually with a rifle at this point, the dog would protect the deer, the fallen prey, until the hunter could come and retrieve this, protect it from other predators like the crows that were coming up. And so in English lore, this is seen as a symbol of the English people's devotion to the monarch and loyalty to the monarch. So the stag is seen as the monarch, especially in Victorian times, and then the little, not so little, the hunting dog as the protector, the loyal subjects of the king. And so Queen Victoria was very taken by Landsevier and this imagery. He painted a number of these works, and it also was reproduced in print form. And a lot of people in the populace bought the prints and liked them. So he was generally very, very popular. And when he died, I think they had a huge state funeral for him, a huge funeral, whether it was state funeral or not. But Victoria loved it. She had Landsevier come and teach her children painting lessons with him. And she was very much enamored with this imagery and this symbolism. Okay, let's move to the next slide. And this is one of the favorites. This is Claude Monet. And this used to be called gladioli. It's now called rounded flower bed or corbel de fleurs. This is in our Impressionist gallery. Generally, this is up. How many of you have seen this one, recognize this one? Okay, right. And did any of you come to the special exhibit that we did, exhibition, where we featured this work, and we talked about the fact that our curator was able to investigate this and find out that the name was incorrect. And it's not unusual that paintings have different names, because over time some of the records get lost, some things were referred to kind of casually. So at some point, whether they had a name originally for this, she was able to establish that there was a name, that corbel de fleurs was the name. A really interesting investigation that she did, looking at the back of the painting and different markings that are on the back of galleries that owned it, and then checking against the logs in the galleries and seeing what was sold at the time. They can date this at the time this went on the market, and they had a list of Monet's works at that time that were given to the gallery, and they were able to match the names. And it is a rounded flower bed, as you can see, so it makes sense, and so it's been renamed officially now as that. So this is really a wonderful example of Impressionist art, and what you're seeing is the glory of a garden. And if we go back, can we go all the way back to the original flower painting? I'll challenge you to go back to that one. Yeah, let's go back. When you look at that, look at all the detail in this. It looks like a photograph. It's precision painting, so synonymous with the Dutch, and so lifelike, really realistic. And let's go back to our Monet. Very different, much freer feeling, isn't it? So the Impressionists were really rebels at the time. Most of you may know that. And they rebelled against that kind of very representational, realistic painting that was the dominant painting that was used in the French Academy. And in France, they really could regulate painting. You were not allowed to show your works unless you had the imprimatur of the French Academy, which was a national organization of artists. And if you painted the way they liked, you got it. And if you didn't paint the way they liked, you couldn't show your works. So these guys really were the rebels. They didn't paint the way they liked. They painted with these dots and little, suggestions of color, not really clear representational work at all. And they were fascinated by spontaneous work. They were fascinated by spontaneous looks, by light, and by gradations of color. They were really very scientific in their analysis of color, what worked together, how complementary colors appeared together, and why they looked a certain way when they were together. So they were many like scientific in their approach, and they wanted to be spontaneous, and they painted en plein air, they painted outside. The technology got to the point then, when in the 1870s, when they began, which would have permitted them to go outside. Portable easels, portable easels and paint in tubes and brushes that could be manufactured instead of handmade, so they could take their easels outside and they could paint and see what they painted at the time. They captured a scene. Before that, there was sketching that was done outside. Artists came in their studios and laboriously worked on something in their studios. These folks were laborious also. They worked very carefully. Although the work was spontaneous, they worked very carefully, and it took them a considerable amount of time to do their work, but their approach was totally different. One thing I love about this one is if you look, that's Camille, his wife, Monet's first wife, and what we used to say was she was probably the tallest of the gladioli. She's there almost looking like a flower herself, standing in the corner in blue, and blue was a day dress. Blue connoted your day dress. I didn't know that. And what you see are gladioli, and then you see geraniums here, and I think maybe in the front of the bed, I'm not sure, but it looks like geraniums or roses in the back. And any of you who've been to Monet's garden in France, help me with the name, guys, the garden, the big garden. Giverny. This is not Giverny. Yes, but when you went to Giverny, you saw all the garden beds that he had and what devotion he had to gardening and how much he loved to paint gardens, which he did. This one was in his house in Argenteuil, which was a suburb of Paris. So he moved out of Paris and Montmartre and moved to the suburb and was able to have a little garden with his home, and he painted many scenes of this rounded flower bed garden. And that was frankly one of the ways that the curator was able to track this. She got other images that he had made of this same garden from other views. This is very famous. Let's go on to the next slide here. This is a photograph that we did when the canvas was removed from its frame. They did all kinds of analysis that gave them an opportunity to look at this, and they could see the kind of the sketchiness of that paint. But they could also see those light areas that look kind of light beige. He had unfinished canvas in that painting, and he used it to create kind of an illumination feeling to the painting when you look at it. But so we found all these areas, and let's advance one more slide. Yeah, this is another one. All that area that's in light there is unfinished canvas. So he left it that way to bring light to the final picture. Let's go back to the original picture. Okay. And you can see some sense of light in that flower bed kind of glowing out at us. That's from the unfinished canvas that he left behind it. So interesting and so clever. Okay, let's move on. And then I didn't say, if you've got questions, I think we'll hold it to the end, and then we'll go over them. So this is a picture of Monet on the left, and this is Camille. And she dies, she dies kind of early in his life. And he does marry again. Okay, let's go on. And you can see, let's go back to that for a minute, because you can see we have photographs now. So one of the things that happened when the Impressionists began to work is the camera had been invented. And that was really a revolution, because people could go out, I mean, they were big, clunky cameras, but you could get a realistic image by using the camera. And so art was sort of freed from its role as a creating memories and creating images, long-lasting images of what something was like. We no longer had to rely on a painting to do that, to have a beautiful portrait or an image of a house or a still life of some kind. We could have the camera do that. And it freed the artist to say, wait, we don't have to do this. We don't have to be as realistic. We can do other things if we so choose. And they did. And the rise of the Impressionists also coincided with the Industrial Revolution and all the change in that. Okay, let's move on. This is another Impressionist, Mary Cassatt, an American and a woman. And she ran with the crew of Impressionists. She was a good friend of Monet's, and he invited her to join them. She didn't like the term Impressionist. She called them something else. But she trained in the United States. They couldn't go to art schools. Women were not accepted in art schools. So she came from a moneyed family. She had private training. And then she went to Paris, which is where you would go. If you were an artist and you wanted to really refine your skills, you would go to Paris. And she did. And she met Monet and the crew of Impressionists. But you can see her work is quite different. much more realistic images. She felt that that's how she wanted to convey her subjects and her art was in a much more realistic way. She often painted mothers and children. She liked them, but also that was accepted for women. If you wanted to sell your work, if you wanted to survive on your art, then you had to do something that was marketable. And for women artists, you painted domestic scenes, you painted mothers and children. And so she liked it, but it also, there was a constraint within which she had to live. When you look at the garden in this scene, in the back, you see that it's very secondary. Whereas in the Corbel de Fleur, Monet's work, it was all about the garden and the flowers and the butterflies. And this one, it's all about the relationship of the child and the mother. And how the mother looks very sweetly at the young girl and how the young girl looks back at the mom. And that beautiful black ribbon, how she made that face of the child dramatic by having the hat and then put that black ribbon to try to rivet our eyes right to the center of this painting. Now this one is normally up also in our Impressionist galleries. Okay, let's move on to the next. Okay, Mary Cassatt. Okay, quite an aristocratic looking lady. And again, a photograph of her. All right, let's move to the next. This is a Japanese work, and it's reeds and cranes. And this, when I was last in the museum, which is now a couple of weeks ago, this was up. It rotates. If you can go down to the Japanese galleries, go, because this is spectacular to see in person. And it's not up all that often. I think when we opened the galleries, at least 2 years ago, maybe 3, 4 maybe years ago, it was up, and now it's up again. So part of the things that we do in the museum is we rotate works. Sometimes it's because they're fragile, like this, I suspect, is fragile, and they have to rest it. And some of the time they want to do it because we own a lot of works, and we want you to see more of them, so we'll rotate them. It's a kind of big production to change up a gallery. You know, nothing is easy. And it is a big production. It's fun if you ever get there during the week, and you'll see a team of, we call them the Men in Black. They're not the Men in Black anymore, fortunately. It's women and men in black. But you'll see people in the museum all dressed in black, and you'll see them with white gloves on. Now, not all of them are men in black. Some of them are volunteers who are trained to dust certain objects. But if they're moving stuff, it's part of the Men in Black. And they're very serious, and they move things. And when you watch them, they're watching each other, and they're watching the artwork, and they're watching everything around it. I mean, they are dealing with a precious object, and you just know it from looking at them. So they're fascinating people. Now, I don't know how I got on the Men in Black here, but okay, moving objects. Okay, so this is a screen, and it was used as a room divider, as we would have used it, but it also has a lot of symbolism in it. One is the cranes itself, the cranes in flight and the cranes on the ground. They were a symbol of longevity and harmony and peace. So very, very popular in Japanese philosophy, art world, philosophy, I guess. The cranes and the reeds were a symbol of old age. Okay, why I don't know, but the cranes definitely of longevity and harmony. And the beautiful scene here with the gold background is called Ma, and Ma was a symbol of like pausing and contemplation and thinking. So they ask us to think about the screen lit up with candles in a darkened room and how it would glow. And you look at that, all that beautiful gold leaf on this, and you would be brought into a meditative state in a darkened room with a glowing symbol. And that was a very positive thing. So they wanted, you know, in the Eastern philosophies, meditation is very important. And they wanted this pause in your life. They also talked about the fact that these were screens associated with the samurai. And the samurai were a particular caste or culture, and they were the warrior caste. But they were not just soldiers, they were very cultured people who studied calligraphy, art, and theater. They were very cultured, very educated. And this was a screen that would have been in a samurai home. So it's absolutely fascinating to study the samurai culture. And if you go into the museum, you'll see not only the screen, but you'll see a samurai helmet. And if you look at that and think about like Star Wars, some of our depiction of those imaginary warriors in our movies like Star Wars came from the samurai, as the samurai helmets. So there's a samurai helmet in the Japanese exhibition, or exhibit. It's almost always up, and when you look at that, think about this screen and then think about Star Wars and the helmets that you see in the Star Wars character. Okay, let's move on to the next. These are more scenes of this. And this Edo period was about 150 years in the 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s. And even though it's associated with the samurai, it was a very peaceful period in Japanese development. Okay, let's move on to the next. I love them in flight. Now we'll see a crane again. And this is a sculpture by Johann Joachim Kandler. And this was the Meissen factory in Germany. The Chinese, thousands of years before this was done, perfected this white porcelain technique. And the West was exposed to it in trade and tried to emulate it and tried to make sculptural objects that were made out of porcelain. And they were strong and they were translucent and white, and they couldn't do it. Well, finally the Germans in the 18th century cracked the code. It was kaolin. It was a certain kind of clay that they could find in China, but they were able to find it or replicate it in the West, and they created this very translucent white porcelain. And so this is a crane again, done. It's large, so it's this big. And it's very hard to cast a clay object that large and not have it break when they're firing it. And so it's really a technical tour de force to create this. And this was the beginning of some of the wonderful European pottery, those glorious things that you'll see in our fashionable living area of the museum, where they learned this technique of creating this translucent pottery. And so it just moves forward from there. Okay, let's move to the next. And this is Eleonora of Toledo. How many people have seen her in the Renaissance galleries? She's always up. And we have a gallery that we call the Medici Gallery, and she is always up to see. And she's huge. I mean, she's very, very big. Like this. And she was actually a postcard. That's what it was called. Bronzino, the workshop of Angelo Bronzino. Eleonora of Toledo was married to a Medici. She was married to Cosimo too. I think if you go on to the next slide, you might be able to see Cosimo. Okay, that's an image of Cosimo. And when you look at that, you say, oh my gosh, that's some kind of a Greek emperor, right? Well, or Roman, how about Roman? That's what he wanted to be. He was the duke of a area, Tuscany, a province in Italy, where Italy had not been joined into a country. The Medicis were the big kahunas for the Renaissance. I mean, this family almost single-handedly supported just a huge amount of artists and gave them free rein, and they developed this marvelous era of art called the Renaissance. And it wasn't just art, it was music, it was theater, it was language, it was a whole relating back to the Greek and Roman times, out of the Middle Ages when it was much more parochial, and then back, this reflowering back to the glories of Greek and Rome. And so he's going to depict himself as a Roman emperor. And you can see him, he looks wizened and old. That bust is in the gallery. But let's go back and show Eleonora. That's his young wife. She has 12 children of his. So she's a young, fertile woman, which at that time, and I guess for a long time, was really an important characteristic. And I said it was a postcard. These paintings by Bronzino were sent to the rulers in Europe. And they were greetings, like a postcard that you would send. And what were some of the symbols that you would see in it? Well, one thing is all the jewels. This is a very wealthy family. you would see that, and you would see the opulent dress, and how rich and luxurious that is. So very wealthy family. She's beautiful, she's young, she's vibrant, and she's very fertile. This is one of her sons that she has here. And how do we know she's fertile? What symbol do we have? Well, in the middle of her bodice there, you'll see what looks like an artichoke. So an artichoke has many, many leaves. And then on her dress, the bottom half of her dress, pomegranates. And what do we know about pomegranates? You open them up and they have all these seeds. Those were images of fertility. And so she's wearing this dress, this beautiful, opulent, very heavy silk dress, with saying, here I am, we're going to be around for a long time. I'm here doing my part, and we're going to be a force to be reckoned with in your culture for a long time. So this is Eleanor of Toledo. Okay, let's move on to the next. That's her husband, okay, Cosmo. And they like to say that, let's go back to Cosmo for a minute, that he married up. She was the daughter of one of the viceroys of the Holy Roman Empire. And she had more status than he did. So he married up when he married her. And let's move on now. And this is a Benin sculpture. You might have heard of these, the Benin bronzes. There's quite a controversy about them now. The country of Benin in West Africa is trying to get them back from the British. I don't know, I've not heard anything about this one, any claims to this one. But they were removed, things were removed from countries under colonial rule. It goes back centuries. The Romans, every empire, did its looting of the native population and gathering of the artifacts back into their museums or their warehouses or their palaces. What's the history of all the European museums, And so this is a Benin bronze. It's in this particular show behind the scenes because of the horse, okay? And the horse was very rare, actually, in West Africa, Central Africa, where Benin is, and because it was very susceptible to, not disease, but infection. There was a tsetse fly, you may have heard of that, and they would attack the horses and bam, they were dead. So there were horses in the Arabian Peninsula further north. When they brought down into tropical Africa, they didn't fare very well. But if you saw a figure seated on a horse, you almost always saw a king. And this was a sculpture that was used when one king died, the second king would have like an altar to his predecessor, and you would see a statue like this. And you see all the regalia on the king and the helmet, and you see it with a red cast. That was a characteristic of the ruling class, but hot-tempered. So, yeah, I think my husband would say that. Maybe I'm part of the ruling class. And the other thing is that they're made from a lost wax technique, a wax model. So let's go down, let's go ahead with the slide. Yeah, this is also on view with the Benin, the figure, and this is not the wax sculpture that generated that metal bronze sculpture, but this is what it would have looked like. So what happened was the artist carved in wax, and then they put it in a mold. They poured bronze into the mold. It hardened. And then what they did was they always left a hole at the bottom of the bronze, or bottom of the mold. They put a candle under that and melted the wax away. And that left the bronze image. This is called lost wax technique. There still are people who do metal sculpture that way or metal artifacts that way. So this is the underlying wax technique. But you can see all the detail on the figure here. That was all carved. And that pedestal, which also told you that it was a king. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next. This is a self-portrait by Otto Dix, German expressionist. This is generally on view in the German expressionist galleries. And when you look at this, when I look at this, his scowling face kind of dominates, doesn't it? Yeah. These folks were painting around, yeah, early 1900s, pretty realistic paintings. He was 19 years old at the time. This is a classic betrothal painting in the Netherlandish is what they call it, Netherlandish art. Let's go to the next slide and see. So this is on the left was a Netherlandish painting, which is a betrothal painting. And you can see that figure is holding the carnation in his hand. And you see Otto Dick's self-portrait with the carnation in his hand. And this figure, normally on the left, would have been paired with the betrothed's painting as well. So they would be two together. The carnation was a symbol of purity and marriage and that kind of thing. And so you would know it was a betrothal painting when you saw the carnation. And so the tie-in here with the garden is that here he is with the figure is with a carnation. And there was something about in the folk culture, the woman would hide the carnation, the bride, on her body, and the groom, after the marriage, would find the carnation. That's the story. We're unclear why Otto Dix decided to do this self-portrait this way. We know he didn't marry for many, many years afterwards. We also know, let's see if is there another picture of him? And they don't have a photo of him. Let's go back again. They don't have a photo. In our training materials, we have a photo of him. He looks like this. He looks kind of stern. But the photo we had was taken in 1939. And he was a soldier in the First World War. And you could really, he was a young man, but you could see the toll that war had taken on him. So whenever I see him, I think about this. I think about these artists who were in the war and the effect that had on them. All right, let's move to the next. This is by Pamela Modersohn-Becker, a young German artist. Let's go on to the next slide, I think. There's going to be a picture of her. We'll go on to the next. This is her. Okay. So just keep that image and let's go back. Yeah. So she did this in 1905. This is over 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And she did peasant women. She lived in the country with her husband. She died at a very young age in childbirth. It was very, very sad. But in the countryside, she saw these peasant women, and she really was fascinated by them and idealized them in many ways. And so she has this peasant woman who has her hands clasped like this on her chest. And if you think about images of Mary in Christian painting, you'll often see her looking down and with her hands like this. And it's a submissive gesture. It's submission. In Mary's case, a certain kind of submission to the plans that the higher powers had for her. And in this woman, it's aging, and the idea that I know my end may be near, and I'm going to accept that. We see the border around her. We see this kind of almost looks like cloud-like, light turquoise border. It's sort of like a halo around her. It's sort of enhancing her and saying, look at this wonderful woman. She's lived a hard life, but she's here and she's, kind of submitting to what her fate is and what her future is. And she gives her that glowing look here. And then also on her lap, and let's go to the next slide, are primroses. And why would primroses be there? They're a symbol of spring and rebirth. But in some ways, this was a story of the woman's life. She had that period of her life where, she was young and probably had children, and the hope and promise of spring, she lived through her life, and at the end of her life is submitting to her future. So a lovely painting. Let's go ahead to the next slide. She painted a number of works. She only painted for about 10 years because, as I said, in her early 30s, she died in childbirth. Really sad. That painting may or may not be in view in the German Expressionist galleries. Let's move on to the next. This one we were trying to see if we could, it's not too bad here actually. This is one of the most famous paintings in the museum. This is a Visitation by Rembrandt. It's the finest Rembrandt that we have, and it is one of his finer works. And this one will go out on loan. It went to the Louvre. So the Louvre borrowed from us, and it did go to the Louvre for one of their shows. It's a masterful work of his. Rembrandt, like a lot of artists of his time that were really well established, had a whole coterie of people working with him, a workshop. It happens now with artists, but it happened certainly then. And there's a whole institution of trying to authenticate Rembrandts that are really Rembrandts, as opposed to follower of, school of, in the style of Rembrandt. And so when you go through our Rembrandt galleries, you'll see a lot of works on the walls, and they'll say school of Rembrandt, or maybe some of them attributed to Rembrandt. This is one of the ones that they say Rembrandt. Okay, they know that he did this. And this is very unique in a number of different ways. The Visitation is a biblical scene, primarily in the Catholic Bible. He was not Catholic, he was Protestant. So there's a real question as to why he would have done this. The Dutch were very fiercely Protestant, very proud of the fact of their independence from the Catholic Church, chafing under Spanish rule when the Spaniards overtook the Dutch. Why would he do this? We're not sure. We think, one, he had a patron, may have had a patron that was Catholic, and two, in his own life, his wife lost several children, young or during the pregnancies. And at the time he painted this, his young wife was pregnant. And so this may have been sort of his own kind of working through of that situation. The figure on the right is Mary. She has just known or become aware of the fact that she's carrying Jesus. And the figure on the left is Elizabeth, her cousin, who's an elderly person who is also miraculously pregnant. She's carrying John the Baptist. And in the Visitation, the two of them meet. The fetuses allegedly recognize each other and begin to move in the womb in recognition of each other. Ezekiel, I think, is a husband of Elizabeth in the back. There's a servant girl on the right. There's a donkey also on the right you can't see. So it's this scene. It's a kind of big Gothic church. It is dark. And the two women, Rembrandt has taken the light and just focused it on those two women, just completely, and on their faces, and on the recognition the two of them have of what their destiny is going to be and how important they're going to be to the world. Why is it in this show? Because there are symbols of Mary and pregnancy and things in this. On the far left, you can barely see it, there are climbing roses. So roses, a climbing rose bush. Roses are a symbol of Mary. The red, a symbol of Jesus' blood. And so every time you see Mary, you'll often see red. That's and the thorns, from the crown of thorns. So that's her symbol. There are 2 or 3 peacocks in this. You can't see them in this. But a peacock was a symbol of Juno and a symbol of, it has to do with Jesus as well. It was seen as it was a Roman symbol, but it was also seen as a symbol of Jesus' death and rebirth. The peacock and the peacock tail. The tail closes, the tail opens, so a symbol of kind of rebirth. Chicks, if you're a gardener, those little chicks and hens, kind of little succulents that you grow, also a symbol of chicks and hens, babies, mothers, children. The dog is a symbol of loyalty, always in Dutch paintings, so that's there. So the flowers, very much a symbol of Mary, and that's the reason that this is in the show. Okay, let's move on. And these are others. You can't see the middle one at all. This is a close-up of Mary and Elizabeth and the little dog. And on the right, I'm thinking I can barely see it myself. I'm thinking it's the rose bush that they're trying to show you. And maybe a peacock, I can't tell. The slides, I'm sorry, are not. When you go, you can see these things much more clearly. Okay, let's move to the next one. Let's go back to that for a minute. I was just going to say that some of the issues with some of these paintings are the preservative finishes that have been put on that over the years, and whether or not those finishes varnishes are going to be removed. And that is very controversial in the art world. And it's a major production to take a work like this and begin to work. We have conservators, and we have a whole conservation department. But to take a work like this and decide that you're going to clean it, big time. So they do it very hesitantly and only if they think it's really endangering the work. But it really colors how we see the works. I mean, if this is not what Rembrandt originally had, you know, or created, but it begins, it's the way we know it. And so people really react when things are cleaned. They don't like it because it's not the image that they've all grown up with. So it's a very, very controversial thing. And the darkness on this may or may not be in part, probably in part from the varnish. Okay, let's go on to the next. This is the Virgin of the Rose Garden, master of the St. Lucy legend. Where does it get the name? I don't know. That's the artist, that's how it was titled. This is a work done in Bruges, and that's Bruges in the background. So this is a work that shows Mary from zero, all these saints from the Middle Ages, and the city of Bruges from 1500s, all in one painting, kind of interesting. Bruges was known as a fabric capital, and there's one of those large towers as a church. The other one is the cloth tower, for how important cloth was. It was a place where cloth was sold to the Flemish community, to the Bruges community. It was their livelihood. It was a major source of their economic wealth. So all these beautiful dresses really are an ode to the Bruges cloth makers. These are all different saints. They all have symbols of their sainthood with them. The center figure is Mary, and Mary is and the saints are in a rose garden, of course, so that all those hedges you're seeing in that archway is a rose garden. Mary, Queen of the Heavens, so above her are two angels, and they're carrying a crown. She's draped in red, that's her color. It's St. Catherine on her right, and baby Jesus is putting a ring on St. Catherine's finger. So she was known as dreaming once that she was the bride of Christ, and I think that figures into Catholic theology later on with the nuns. But she dreamt that, and then she was, martyred. So that's Jesus putting that on her, which is her symbol. You have another saint, and I don't know all the names here, who's carrying a lily. But this would have been the scene of Mary and all these beautiful women in their lovely attire in a garden that very much talked about Mary and her symbolism. Okay, let's move on to the next. And that's a little close-up, okay. So you're seeing that scene, and you're seeing the roses. And then down at the bottom, they said there were strawberries. So that was a field of strawberries as well. Okay, let's move to the next. This is Parvati. This is South Indian, and this is in our gallery, in our South Asian gallery. It's fascinating. The museum has collections that we've had. We opened in the 1880s. So things have been collected by different curators for a long period of time. Our South Asian collection is a lot of religious objects. Not simply, this is Hindu, we have many other objects of other religions. It's a skewed representation of, Asia, but we can't redo everything. We have a collection. We try to make it representational of what we own and of important pieces. So you're going to see a lot of religious pieces here, as well as some contemporary pieces that we're integrating more and more into the collection as we get them. Parvati is a Hindu god. She was married to Shiva. There are thousands of Hindu gods. The major one is Brahma, and I think he's the creator, and Vishnu, who is the protector, and Shiva, who is a destroyer. And she's married to Shiva, and she balances him out. She kind of tries to control him. Normally, she is seen all robed with silk and flower garlands. That's part of the reason she's here. She's also often shown on a lotus flower, and that's what she's standing on here. But she would not be seen by the public nude like this, or half nude. She would have been stored in a Hindu temple this way, but before she was brought out, she would be festooned with beautiful silk robes. Let's go on to the next. let's see, there's a lotus flower. Okay, let's go on again. Okay, so now you'll see her kind of festooned with flower garlands, with beautiful silk robes. And the sense, the idea is that these gods, when you saw them, really were inhabited the sculptures. So they were there. So when you offered garlands or you offered silk clothing to these images, you were offering it to the god. And the god was there to communicate with you and to be present in your life. So it was very important, these processions. People would get to see the gods. We'd have an opportunity to have them see them. It would be very important. And people also had small shrines in their homes, and they would have little images of the gods there, and they would communicate with the gods at that time. So you see this beautiful parade and all these beautiful clothing and flower garlands all over this figure. And yeah, so when she's paired with Shiva, they're a symbol of harmony and peace and marital accord. And she's not normally shown alone. She's normally paired with him. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is the Virgin and Child with angels. And this is very, very famous. Benzo Gazzoli? Yeah, Gazzoli. This one is usually up in the Renaissance galleries in the museum. If you should see it in person because it glows. It's so beautiful. This is very ornate. It's painted with jewels. They're actually jewels that are embedded in the paint. It's very kind of over the top. And it was only meant to be seen by the clergy. It was not on view for the population. But it was this glorious celebration of mother and child, and a Renaissance portrait. And you see her in here, there's red surrounding her, but she's in a blue garment, which is usually associated with Jesus. Let's see, there are various categories of angels beside her. The halo above her is Hail Mary, full of grace. The wording in the halo behind Jesus is a Latinized Greek for Jesus, for the name Jesus. And it's in this show really because Jesus is holding in his left hand a little bird. And so let's go on to the next slide. Okay. Well, this one is Mary, Queen of the Heavens, and that's her symbol there. And then the different angels that are in the painting. And let's go on to the next. You see the little bird that he's holding, and there's the bird. It's a European goldfinch. And if you notice the face of the goldfinch, behind the beak is a red. And the story is that when Jesus was on the cross, a little goldfinch came by and plucked a thorn from his crown as he's on the cross. And the bird was splashed with Jesus' blood. And that ever since then, the goldfinch has had that red face. Isn't it an interesting story? And so it's very much the story of the Catholic theology and how nature fits into that with this little goldfinch. Okay, let's move to the next. This is a magnolia blossom by Imogen Cunningham. This is a photograph. This would not be normally on view. It's very dramatic. Cunningham was one of the first, certainly women photographers. Women were very present in the world of photography, and there were a lot of very excellent women photographers. It was a field that was very amenable to women. I'm not sure why, because some of the early cameras were huge. I mean, they were huge and heavy. It wasn't that it was easy to use. Cunningham began in 1900 to work in photography. And she worked for her entire career. She worked until she was 93 when she died. She was taking photographs almost throughout. She had a very varied career. She was known, one of the things she was known for were these flower photographs. She did a lot more than that. She did industrial, she did street photography, but she was known for these. And so no one had done, I'm not sure no one had done them, but few had done them. And these were incredible. So she had the eye to see this. And for our eyes, it's a very contemporary and very bold kind of photography. It's timeless, but this was done in 1924. And let's move to the next. Okay. This is a photo she did of Frida Kahlo. And this is her self-portrait in 1933. And again, she lived to be 93 years old. Let's see if there's another image in here. Okay, not. Oh, let's go back to that. Some of the presentation copies that I have of this have other paintings of hers in it. She did a number of different works. She's fascinating because she survived as a photographer. She made her living doing it. In the 1940s, she linked with Ansel Adams. He invited her to be on the faculty of the photography school in the West, California School of Photography, which had these stellar people on the faculty. She was admitted to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in her older years. An amazing, accomplished artist, teacher, just incredible person. And she did some interesting photos of people as well. It was just fascinating. Well, this one of Frida Kahlo, kind of classic image. Okay, let's move to the next. This one is Sarah Sees. She's an Asian, but American artist. And this is a piece that's up always in contemporary. Now, the contemporary galleries are being redone. And so they're slowly being unveiled. When you go up there in the museum, I really encourage you to go up there because there are different objects on view in different galleries being kind of rolled out a bit at a time. I don't know if they're going to do a grand opening, but they're telling us that it's not going to be completed until 2024. Mm-hmm. So this had been up. I don't know if it's up now. It's an installation piece. It's called an installation piece. It's also called a still life. So if you remember that floral painting at the beginning, that was a still life. This is a still life. Talk about compare and contrast the floral painting with this. This is fascinating because, in part, it's called From Triple Point of Water. I've seen a picture of Triple Point of Water. It's an entire room, not this size, but maybe half this size, of installations like this, variations of this. And she did like 20 of them in a room. And it was a commentary on modern ecology and modern technology and what it's doing to the world. And this was done in 2004. So what you see in here are a lot of natural things that are unnatural and unnatural things that are made to look natural. So you see at the top the twigs, and that's a root ball at the bottom, painted orange. So you see in the middle all that orange. It's a tree branch that she painted orange. Cautionary color, orange. And then you see in the middle, you can't make it out very well here, an aquarium. So it's an aquarium. It's got water, some water in it. There's water being pumped through this work in various stages, and it does come into the aquarium. So she's got that. She has, on the right, you can see blue. That's styrofoam made to look like a human spine. She has a glass, a goblet filled with water. You have water moving through this piece. The only live thing in the piece is the moss. And they actually tell us that the curators or some of their assistants have to come through periodically and cut the moss so it doesn't get to be too kind of amazing. There are paper plates in there. Some of them simulate some other body parts of humans. And the story is kind of a cautionary tale about what we're doing to our environment, what we're doing with chemicals, with things like styrofoam, and the thing that we make paper plates out of, that we're really introducing all kinds of chemicals and unnatural things into the environment, and what the effect is going to be on people and on the environment. And she said, and it's all powered by technology. I thought that was interesting, because you see very prominently there's a plug at the bottom, and then it goes over to an outlet on the wall. But that plug is orange. So it's all powered by technology, and it's all pumping and flowing. And they said that periodically they have to add water to the system because it evaporates, and that was part of what she was trying to tell us too, was about the system, and that it's a lifelike thing, and the water's evaporating out of it. So it's really an interesting story. And can you imagine a room full of these? Different, they all look a little bit different, but they basically have that same shape. So there's triple points of water. So let's move on to the next. Close up, so you can see some of the things in here. You can see the spine on the right, roughly, it's made out of styrofoam. There, you can see the goblet here, and there's some, that bubbles, so there's a aerating tube or something in that. You can see the paper plates here. And you can definitely see the twigs, the branch. flowing through it. Okay. Let's move on. Yeah. Okay, triple points of water. All right, so now you're seeing part of the installation, where it came from. So it's fascinating, just fascinating. Okay, let's move to the next. The Hummingbirds and Orchids. This is by Martin Johnson Heed, an American. We have this up in the American landscape galleries. And what you notice is those little birds. And they're called something Shira hummingbirds. There's a name for them. It has 2 or 3 names. And they exist in South America. Heed went to South America and did only 12 paintings, but 12 paintings of hummingbirds and orchids. And the pairing of the two, look how much the little hummingbird looks like the orchid that it lives with and pollinates. So they have this symbiotic relationship. You know, he needs the pollen to survive, and the orchid needs him to propagate the orchids. And the little hummingbird is kind of mimicking the shape of the orchid itself. It's just fascinating. And these beautiful paintings of this work. And they said that he'd reinvented this style, which merged landscape painting with still life painting. So it's like a still life of a flower, and then a landscape, and the bird, and a still life of the bird as well. Beautiful bird. And let's move on to the next. See if they give us okay. Cora's sheer-tailed hummingbird. That's a little hummingbird. Yeah. Okay, let's move to the next. And this is, I think, the final work here, which is Romain Bearden's Quilting Time. This is up in the area that's the Kresge Court, where our special exhibitions are, and it's on the wall. It's huge. It's a mosaic made out of glass tiles. But Bearden created it, conceived of it, drew created the manic. I'm not sure I'm saying it right, but it's a little model of this. And then glass blowers in Italy, he commissioned them to create the glass tiles. He specified, I mean, every single tile, every color, he specified, and they did it to his specifications. It came to us in 3 large pieces. It's so heavy that it was put up on one wall, I think it's an exterior wall, and they said it will not move. Because it's so heavy, it's impossible to move the thing, even though 3 pieces. But what's fascinating to me about it, I've been around the museum for a while, and it always sat in the corner side in this one area by itself. Now they've brought in friends for it. Now they have other large African-American pieces, including Kindahela Wiley's Warrior and Charles McGee's Noah's Ark, other monumental works of African-American painters together with him. And then they have some other African-American paintings in another room adjacent to him. So I said, finally, they've given him a community, and he's not just by himself. Now, what will happen as the contemporary galleries unfold, it's not clear whether they'll keep these works where they are or whether they're going to move the others back into the African-American galleries. I'm voting, and I love any of you who agree with me, to have the whole African-American galleries move down to the first floor. I think they ought to be right at the center of the museum where people come in. So if anybody agrees with me, you can send a little comment card to Salvador. They read the comment cards. Seriously, they do. The higher-ups read them. So address one to Salvador and tell him if you want it anywhere else. I also have a pitch that the Native American galleries and American galleries ought to be merged. Seems to me that it sounds reasonable. But anyway, that's my little shtick. This is Bearden's. This was commissioned by the DIA in commemoration of our 100th anniversary in 1985. And it's Bearden's remembrance of North Carolina. He was born in North Carolina. He, as a young person, went to live with his family in New York. So he was part of the Great Migration. And he remembered, though, coming back to the South and to North Carolina to visit family. And this is a remembrance of a family in a park in North Carolina. So you see the park scene, you see the birds, and you see the trees, and you see sort of mountains here. But you see family. This is very much about family. The figures have a sort of very characteristic Romain Bearden style to them. He is very stylized figures, faces that look a bit Egyptian sometimes, but they're very much his works. If you look at his works, you can kind of tell by the figures and the faces, and the dress. That sort of almost colonial-looking dress is something that he uses for his figures. But what we're seeing is the importance of like family time together, the quilting, and the music making that he remembers from living and from visiting neighbors, and how generations of family are together, how the wise women of the family are doing the quilts, and the quilts have, you know, bits and pieces of clothing that was important to people in their lives. So it's a symbol of kind of stitching together a life of a family in a quilt. And that's going on. You see the little girl, you see the quilting objects here. You see a younger person kind of in a very kind of protective way around one of the grandmother figures. And you see what I hope is a gentleman carrying a baby there in the middle. So this is his memory quilting time and how important that was for him. Let's see if there's another slide. I think not. Let's see. Ah, good. This is a picture of Romain Bearden with his cat. And let's see if there's another. Okay. This is a slide for Van Gogh is unfortunately gone. We have a special exhibition now, which is James Barnor, B-A-R-N-O-R, a Ghanaian photographer. So he's quite well known. It's a traveling exhibition. It's supposed to be very, really beautiful. He does a lot of work of people. I think he has some base in London as well as in Ghana. And so that will be on in the photographic area of the museum as a special exhibition. Okay, so we are done. If you guys have any questions, how are we doing on time? We're not bad. A little bit over, but yeah, there's another speaker coming in, but we certainly have time for any questions. A couple.
It says there January 22nd, 2023. Does that mean it's gone now?
Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah, that's it.
We just haven't swapped out the slide. Yeah.
I'm just curious, this is probably an impossible question, but do you have a favorite gallery? Like, what's the one you always have to hit whenever you're there?
It's probably African American. Yeah, for me, that's the one I like. We're a unique museum to have an African American gallery. Most museums don't. There's a whole issue about whether you want to, identify something as a particular characteristic.
Right.
You have Italian galleries, you have Greek galleries,
Right.
and the thought here was very purposeful when it was developed in 2000 with the help of GM, which funded it. They said, we're an African American city, and we want people to be able to come in and see the works of their people, of our people. And if you go in most other museums, in contemporary galleries, just usually where you find the work, you have the works, and you have no idea who that. Now, you may by the subject guess, but not always, you don't know. And this way, we were able to develop some chronology and some themes in those galleries, and we were able to show people the breadth of the work and the depth of the work, which you don't see when you see individual pieces.
Right.
So it gives you a whole different perspective. So I very much admire that, and that's where I go. Okay. Thanks for asking.
Yeah.
Any other questions that you have? Okay, please come down. We're open and free. You're welcome. We are free to the Tri-County area. So the only thing that isn't some special exhibitions we have to charge for, like Van Gogh. But otherwise, we're totally free, so please come.
This is good. It motivates me to go back.
Good.
And I have to remember, you don't have to see the whole museum.
Oh, absolutely not.
At one time.
Right, and there are public tours done by docents almost every day, at 1 on Friday, at 1 and at 6. And each of us does a different tour. So if you go down a couple of times, you'll get a real interesting view of the museum. Like you said, you won't see everything, but you'll see 5 or 6 pieces that somebody really has some interest in and wants to show you as major representations of the museum, and you'll see different ones. So it's a good way to get an overview.
That's a great tip. Thank
Okay.
you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, good.